This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. In recent weeks, the Trump administration has been targeting international students for their participation in pro-Palestinian protests or speech. In early March, Columbia University student and Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil was arrested and detained. Khalil played a prominent role in the pro-Palestinian protests on the Columbia campus. President Donald Trump posted to Truth Social that Khalil's arrest was, quote, the first arrest of many to come. Here in New England, Tufts University student and Fulbright scholar Rumeysa Ozturk was recently taken into custody by masked immigration officials. Last year, Ozturk co-authored an opinion piece in the Tufts student newspaper criticizing the university's response to student demands that Tufts divest from companies with ties to Israel and to acknowledge the, quote, Palestinian genocide. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has indicated that around 300 students have been targeted so far. But what does the crackdown mean for international students here in Connecticut and beyond? Today, we'll hear about that, plus the legal rights international students have in the U.S. Joining us now is Kirk Carapesa. He's a managing editor and correspondent for higher education at GBH News in Boston. Kirk, welcome to Where We Live.
Hey, good to be here, Catherine.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have a story you'd like to share with us related to international students. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Kirk, you've been following this story really closely recently and beyond that. What are you hearing from international students right now?
Well, many of them don't want to talk to us on the record. They're afraid to have their names out in public. But I would say there is a general sense of uncertainty in most cases, and in some cases, fear. International students at colleges in and around Boston are dealing with what I would describe as serious anxiety. And this comes after President Trump's executive order to have ICE, target pro-Palestinian international students for deportation. But it's not just students who participate in those protests. We're hearing about cases of, foreign students who have violations or DUIs who might be in the crosshairs. And international students of all political views are worried right now. Some foreign students have told me that they're afraid to leave the U.S. in case they're not let back in. Others are afraid to even walk down the street for fear of arrest. Mm-hmm. So I think the international higher ed community is facing a lot of challenges and concerns and anxiety right now.
And we're definitely going to get into those challenges and anxieties as the conversation goes on today. And as GBH has reported, Tufts University student Rumeysa Ozturk was taken recently into custody by masked immigration officials. How is Tufts responding to that?
The university isn't saying much at this point. The night she was taken into custody, the president of Tufts issued a statement to the community. He said that the university had no prior warning about her arrest. Since then, administrators have recognized how frightening and distressing this situation is for the entire campus community, including international students, staff, and faculty who might be feeling especially vulnerable at this moment. The Tufts has reissued some guidance about engaging with government officials. It's recommending students carry documentation to prove their immigration status, and it's also advised visa holders to consult their advisors before traveling internationally.
And do you know what's the latest in her case so far?
Yeah, so since she was arrested last week here in Somerville, she's been held in an ICE facility in Louisiana. And we should note that she has not been charged with anything yet, but her visa has been revoked. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has defended that decision. He says this is now a priority for the U.S. government. They've already revoked 300 visas, I think, nationally. Her attorneys are challenging her detention. They argue that her rights have been violated because of that op-ed you mentioned she wrote in the student newspaper advocating for human rights in Gaza. There's a hearing in her case set for today. Our immigration reporter, Sarah Bedencourt, here at GBH, has been following the case closely, doing a great job on this with all the details and the timeline. There's questions about when she was deported and whether the injunction came in time. But the Trump administration is pushing for a lawsuit that calls for her release to be dismissed, and her attorneys and now the ACLU of Massachusetts say they're going to keep fighting for her release.
Well, and this is a high-profile case that certainly a lot of people are following. And as you're covering the local/regional areas in terms of campus reactions to this. What are you hearing from other universities? Are arrests happening at other colleges in the Boston area?
Not yet. Not here in the Boston area. I mean, you mentioned the case in New York at Columbia. There was another arrest, I believe, at Georgetown. We have seen some cases where researchers and faculty have been stopped at the border. But my sources are telling me that students who are afraid and some who have participated in the pro-Palestinian protest have received visits from federal agents, including the FBI, which is increasing a lot of the stress. And I reached out to the FBI this week. They declined to comment on that. But generally speaking, a spokesperson told me that the agency can never open an investigation based solely on protected First Amendment activity. The agency respects the rights of individuals to peacefully protest and exercise their First Amendment rights, and it doesn't target them for their political views, race, ethnicity, or religion. Still, some international students who'd been living off campus, I know at MIT, are trying to move back onto campus. They see this as a safer option. As for colleges and their administrators, they're in a bind. There's not much they can do at this point. Mm-hmm. I think many of them are trying to comply with authorities and not draw attention to themselves. That's why, they dismiss my request and other media requests to talk on the record. But like Tufts, behind the scenes, they are advising students to reconsider upcoming travel. MIT, for example, I know is urging international students who are on, who have temporary visas and even green card holders to rethink their travel. In an email last month, the deans there told students that visa rules and restrictions can change very quickly and without prior warning. So I think they're trying to, support the community without drawing attention to themselves at the same time.
Well, and you spoke with Fanta Av, who's the CEO of Association of International Educators, and she told you, echoing what you just shared with us, really, that colleges and universities are doing the best they can with the information that they have right now.
They're incredibly dedicated and committed to making sure that students, know their rights and responsibilities, but more importantly, that they're in compliance when it comes to immigration status. So the fact that they're not, definitive answers, I think, heighten their anxiety, and we definitely understand that.
And Kirk, go for it.
And she also pointed out to me that it's important, to keep perspective here and consider the sheer number of international students. There are more than 1 million here in the U.S. So while these cases are distressing for students and for the community, and we're all reading about them, her message to students was really, work with your universities, try to get the support and the help that you need, but also don't jeopardize your studies. And I think that's why we're seeing so much guidance around travel and, documentation.
Well, and I think with what Off shared too, it echoes a lot with what we're hearing here as well, with the heightened anxiety and the uncertainties that both faculty and students are sort of navigating together. What else are you hearing from those who are working directly with international students in the Boston area?
I mean, some of the stories are heart-wrenching, to be honest. I've heard from professors who, advise students and they're, showing up in their office, crying or sobbing because they feel like they won't be able to travel or continue their research. I've heard from faculty who say students are having trouble finding jobs in labs right now, and that's related to some of the federal funding cuts and caps on NIH grants. So it's just a really uncertain time. I've been covering the higher ed beat for a while now, and I've never seen the industry quite like this, where everyone is kind of circling the wagons and doesn't want to say anything and talk. But yeah, it's a lot of on background conversations with people who don't want to identify themselves for fear of being targeted.
Well, and with your reporting, you also spoke with MIT linguistics professor Michel DeGroff, who told you that he has students who are scared to leave the country in case they are turned away upon their return.
Last week was spring break, and many students had already, some of them had tickets to go see the family, some of them in the Middle East, and they could not do that. So they had to change plans. Some of them lost money because they couldn't get reimbursed for the plane tickets that they had already bought.
So, Kirk, this is another way of disruption to student life. How are students responding to what's going on and responding to the arrests? Because this is this is not what I think they expect when they're living their lives on campus and also getting their education.
Yeah, Michelle DeGraff told me they're trying to find solidarity in their community to have meals together, support each other. As I said before, there have been instances where students who are living off campus are trying to move back on campus, thinking that might be safer. I think the video of the graduate student at Tufts being apprehended really shook people, and I think seeing those streets, I have colleagues and friends and family, who went to Tufts, and I think seeing those streets where they all lived and worked and studied, and seeing that was really jarring. And I think everyone's processing it differently. Of course, if you were involved in one of the pro-Palestinian protests, the heightened anxiety is that much more intense. Mm-hmm. But I've talked to students who weren't involved, but just because they're international, they have heightened anxiety, and some of them are even afraid of identifying as an international student. And so I think it's creating this chilling effect where people are afraid to speak their mind about these sensitive issues. This also comes on the heels of many schools adopting what's called institutional neutrality in higher ed, where colleges basically pledge that they would not weigh in on international or issues that don't involve the mission of the schools. This was in backlash to Hamas's attack on October 7th, and Harvard and other schools issuing statement after statement trying to get it just right. And now I think many of them are just trying to get out of that business. So it's a really interesting moment for higher ed, and it's an industry too that is embattled. Many Americans have lost trust in colleges, and I think these schools are trying to restore that trust.
Well, and similar to your experience, ahead of this hour, Where We Live reached out to more than dozens of international students at 11 colleges and universities here in Connecticut, and none of them wanted to speak with us using their full names due to fears of retaliation. And we did have one student who told us that they're being careful about what they say on social media because they think their freedom of speech rights are limited for the first time in their life. What do you make of that, Kirk? Have you found similar concerns from students who are scared to speak publicly, not just physically out and about, but also on social media?
Yeah, it is in many ways, this is a media story too. We're all getting our information from different channels, right? And there's reports. I know Axios has done some reporting on this. There's reports of the administration trying to use AI to monitor students' social media. It's hard to cut through the noise right now. There's so much noise between DC and higher ed institutions right now, and I think students find themselves in the middle of that. And if you're a digital native, if you put yourself in these students' shoes, many of them went through puberty on social media. They went through the pandemic on Zoom, and now they're landing on these campuses in a foreign country. And yeah, they're seeing these reports that everything they say might be monitored or scrutinized. So yeah, I've heard similar stories where students are afraid of posting things on social media, and they're worried about their speech being monitored online. And the op-ed is a perfect example of that, right? If a student can be, if that's what the government is charging her with for writing an op-ed, then that's going to create a real chilling effect in American higher education following the protest last spring. We saw, I remember interviewing students during the protest who were, masking themselves. They didn't want to be identified. Those who did identify themselves and were quoted in some of my stories, I know were later doxxed. And that is, a reality for many of these students. And it undermines academic freedom. It undermines open debate on our college campuses.
Well, and another student told us that they feel like they have to watch everything they do, which is a sentiment that you share with us similarly based on your reporting on what you've been hearing from students. So relating to that, as everything is so connected here, are colleges in the Boston area bracing for how these arrests might impact enrollment of international students?
I think so. the Harvards of the world are going to be okay. MIT is going to be, when your admissions rate is 3-6%, whatever it is, they can fill their seats 100 times over with students, international, domestic, all who have perfect SAT and SATs and grades. But those other schools, schools like Boston University, Northeastern, they rely on these students, right? And the higher ed leaders I'm talking to say the U.S. should never take for granted that international students will just keep coming to our shores. And there's a track record for this. During the first Trump administration, we did see a 12% drop in the number of international students. In part, you'll remember, because of travel bans and visa restrictions. And so I think those schools are really worried about how this might affect their enrollment, whether it's some of the rhetoric that we hear, and also these issues with visa restrictions and ICE raids. Here in New England, we're already facing this demographic cliff where we're going to see the shortage of 18-year-olds dry up here, and so these schools need students. And I know some enrollment managers have told me, if you're not near an airport where international students can get to you, the clock is ticking for a lot of your programs or your entire schools. And we've already seen a record number of colleges close and merge here. So I think that is a real concern.
Well, and there are so many aspects to this too, because this is also a time where colleges are navigating cuts to funding for research, as you touched on a little bit earlier. Based on your reporting, is there a fear that if colleges don't cooperate with ICE, will they be at risk for funding cuts or more funding cuts?
Yeah, I think we saw what happened at Columbia with the threat of $400 million last month, and there's a lot at stake. I think higher ed is really under attack. This is unprecedented from what I hear from many of the presidents and former presidents I talked to. That reduction of funding for research is really affecting many graduate students, especially those who are international, but everybody in general. So, some students, as I said, are struggling to find work in labs. That's one major squeeze. I know there are also some international programs run out of the U.S. Education Department that have been frozen. And so the timing really couldn't be worse. We're in admission season right now. So schools are trying to make decisions about next year's class. UMass Medical in Worcester, I know, rescinded some offers to people who'd already been admitted. And other schools are capping graduate school admissions. One former college president told me that if the administration gets its way and the NSF, National Science Foundation, and NIH are able to reduce funding and cap indirect costs for grants, we're at risk of losing a generation of scientists. And I thought that was initially hyperbole. And as I talk to more and more people, they tell me that this is a real concern on campus. So I think that's, there's a lot at stake. And, we're seeing, we live in a global society, right, where there's global mobility. So these students have choices now. They don't have to come to the U.S. We're a hub here in Boston and Cambridge, but we're seeing, other countries that are facing the same demographic and workforce challenges that we're facing, places like Germany, China, India, France, Japan, South Korea, Spain. I heard Poland and Kazakhstan are also in the game now, recruiting and trying to attract and retain our international students.
Right.
It's a global marketplace, and these students have a lot of choices. And I think in the end, international students and their families are just like American students and their families. They want predictability. They want to know that they and their kids are going to feel safe and welcome here, and they have options.
You've been listening to Kirk Carapeza, who's the managing editor and correspondent for higher education at GBH News. Kirk will be staying with us, and coming up next, we'll hear more about the experiences of international students at this political moment. Are you an international student, or do you work at a college or university? We want to hear from you. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're hearing about the experiences of international students at this political moment. Recently, the Trump administration has been targeting international students who have participated in pro-Palestinian protests or speech. Here in Connecticut, Jewish faculty and students at the University of Connecticut, Trinity College, and Yale University signed a letter denouncing Trump's attack on pro-Palestine protesters and called for universities to, quote, cease any voluntary collaboration with federal immigration enforcement. Still with us is Kurt Carapeza, who's a managing editor and correspondent for higher education at GBH News. And joining us now is Liam Knox. He's an admissions and enrollment reporter at Inside Higher Ed. Liam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And also joining us is Clay Harmon, who's the executive director of AIRC, which is a membership organization focused on recruiting and enrolling international students. Thanks so much for joining us today, Clay.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
So, Clay, I want to start with you here. If you can explain the distinction between international students and immigrants, because they have different rules to follow and rights, correct?
Absolutely. International students who generally are on F1, M1, or J1 visas are classified as non-immigrants, meaning that in order to receive that visa, they actually have to demonstrate that they do not intend to remain in the United States long term, but rather they're coming to complete a specific program and then return to their home countries. And F1 and M1 student visas are already the most tightly vetted and closely tracked non-immigrants in the US. There's a computer system called the Student Exchange Visitor Information System, wherein the government actually keeps track of their enrollment and location of every single international student in the country.
And I think in the most basic terms, what are the most common student visas that international students hold?
The F1 is the most common. It is the visa that is designed for a longer term academic program and typically used to earn a degree. J1 visas, there's a variety of categories. Those are called international exchange visitor visas. Some are for short-term programs of different kinds, and in some cases, students can stay and earn a degree on them. And the third category is M1 visas, which are for vocational and technical study.
Can you walk us through how international students end up at colleges and universities here in the U.S.? What is the role of organizations like the Association of International Enrollment Management in helping facilitate that process?
Absolutely. So the process starts with the admissions office, and institutions invest a lot in recruitment of international students in traveling overseas and spending money on social media ads and doing a lot of similar activities that they may do to recruit domestic students. But of course, there are different channels and tactics for the international markets. And then once the student has received an admission letter from an institution, that kicks off the entire visa process, which is a separate application that they must undergo with the US government. And it includes an in-person interview at a US embassy or consulate located overseas, which is typically a high-stress situation across a pane of glass. And the student typically has about 60 to 90 seconds in which to express to that visa officer why they're attending this institution, what is it about this program that attracted them. And the visa officers have the discretion to make a subjective judgment on whether they believe that student is a risk to immigrate to the United States as part of their evaluation. So AIRC, we're involved in a variety of ways in terms of professional development, in increasing the knowledge base and professionalism in the field, in helping institutions connect to important resources to find those great markets and find partners who can help in international markets. And we also have a certification program for international student recruitment agencies, which are companies whose business model includes helping international students find the right fit college for them here in the US.
It sounds like organizations like the one you're involved in is a bridge between students and universities here. But it also sounds like we already have a pretty robust infrastructure in place to sort of go through that process. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, there is quite a robust infrastructure. I mean, keep in mind that international education is classified as a service export, and it usually ranks among the top 5 to 10 service exports of the United States, with an estimated total economic impact of around $44 billion last year to the US economy. So there is a pretty significant infrastructure in place to support it. Institutions have to invest in staff and training and access to the CVIS system in order to comply with all of the mandates that the government places on them to host international students. There is a large industry of companies who are involved in helping make those connections between institutions and students.
So, we've been talking about how international students are being targeted by the Trump administration this hour. And you've been listening the conversation with Kirk from GBH News earlier. How are students being identified as potential targets? Can you talk about what that process is like?
I would only know what I read in the news about what Secretary Rubio is saying and what other government spokespeople have been saying.
Mhm.
It sounds as though from news reports that there is an element of political speech in reviewing the students' social media posts and other activities. We do know Secretary Rubio did just issue a directive to all U.S. embassies and consulates overseas that visa officers are supposed now to review social media posts and histories and take screenshots of them for many international visa applicants, including those who are going for a visa renewal who've already been in the United States for some time, and that the social media posts are intended to have some kind of role in making visa issuance decisions. This infrastructure that I talked about, this is a very, very involved, significant investment that institutions and students have made, and already a very extensive vetting process to assure all involved around national security concerns for students. And so to add in an apparently arbitrary or capricious element, especially with minimal process, and especially if it does touch on political speech, is unfair to institutions and students and could potentially violate students' constitutional rights if that's actually the case.
Liam, I would love for you to jump in on this too. If you can expound more about the mechanisms for ICE flagging a student and what role does Secretary of State Marco Rubio play in this process?
Certainly. So, Secretary of State Rubio plays a large role in some of the justification here. There's been, from my reporting, a lot of the students who've had their visas revoked, who are being targeted by ICE, are doing so. The federal immigration authorities are doing so using a clause in the Immigration and Nationality Act that basically gives the Secretary of State broad power to flag a student as a potential foreign policy risk or national security risk. That seems to be the grounds for a lot of these revocations. That's been really flummoxing university officials who try to help students with visa problems, who immigration lawyers who are trying to adjust to a very rapidly changing environment here. And really, that's because this justification has rarely been used. I talked to an immigration lawyer who worked with a group of colleagues to kind of examine the case law around this and found that out of 11.7 million cases in the 35-year history of this clause, it's only been used 15 times before this administration came in, and now it's been used hundreds of times. And so certainly part of this is about policing speech, looking at the records of students who were arrested in connection with the encampment protests last year. Looking at social media seems to be, by all accounts, there's been reporting like Kirk and Clay mentioned that has been a directive from the State Department lately. But it is also not just students who participate in protests. There seem to be a dragnet as well of students who are having their visas revoked and then their legal residency terminated and are being targeted by ICE over past criminal charges, some of them very minor infractions, some of them from many, many years ago, things like running a stoplight or a DUI from 5 or 10 years ago in some cases I heard. In many cases, students will see either that they will just see a notice on their system that they failed to maintain their status. And I've talked to university officials, I've talked to students who are totally bewildered by that and have no idea what it is they could have done, which is a frightening prospect.
Well, and we've been sort of dissecting all the reportings with so many things that echo each other in terms of student and faculty experiences, and of course, we're seeing a lot of the headlines focused on Columbia and Tufts, but this is actually happening everywhere, correct? Where to much smaller regional public colleges who might have smaller international student offices that may not have the resources or the information to deal with this.
Absolutely. And I've been talking to those folks too, and they are overwhelmed trying to adapt to, like I said, this world that they've navigated their whole careers, the student visa system that they've dedicated themselves to and thought that they knew is kind of being broken up and changed and upended overnight, it almost seems like. I talked to just today, uh, uh, talked to someone at Oklahoma State Stillwater who had a few students whose visas were revoked. News came out yesterday. I heard from um, international student offices at Arizona State University and Colorado State University. And I mean, these are large schools, but places and that rely heavily on international students, maybe more heavily than a lot of people realize at some of these schools to, you know, pay full tuition to keep their revenue up as higher ed funding, especially at regional, smaller public colleges, lags, who are a kind of a crucial part of the ecosystem there and are facing problems that they've never had to deal with before, are going into their student visa databases and you know, seeing that ICE has terminated not just a student's visa, which usually means they can stay in the country, keep enrolling in classes. University officials can try to help them out. Um, uh, uh, but also their permanent status, and they're having to advise students on things that, in some cases, I've talked to officials who didn't even know that was possible. That's how unprecedented a move it was, and so there's a lot at stake there because, um, like I think Kirk mentioned, there are real threats to colleges from the Trump administration, kind of going hand in hand with some of these immigration efforts. I've talked to officials who've received letters that basically demanding that they cooperate with investigations into foreign students and hand over records, and if they, with the threat of decertifying them, meaning uh, taking away their ability to enroll student visa holders altogether if they don't comply. Uh, and This is something that other reports have said the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security are considering as a kind of cudgel as they try to carry out their immigration policy on campuses. And so, students are terrified and university officials are terrified, and neither of them really know how to respond to a situation that they have no familiarity with.
We mentioned earlier too that we also reached out to more than a dozen students here in Connecticut, and no one wanted to speak to us using their full names due to those fears of retaliation, like you've mentioned. And we had one student who told us that there is a constant fear that one wrong interaction or reaction could derail everything. And today we've been talking a lot about threats that these students could potentially have. And I think earlier Kirk mentioned that Marco Rubio has justified the revocation of 300 or more student or visitor visas because the visa holders were engaging in activities that he said, quote, counter to our national interest, to our foreign policy. So I think I want to pose this question to Liam, and maybe Clay, you can answer this too. Where have you heard of any international students recently studying here in the United States who were a threat to national security? Liam, maybe we'll have you start first.
Sure, happy to. I have not. I mean, it certainly depends on how the Trump administration is defining a threat to foreign policy. There's an understanding, or I would say a real kind of attempt to paint this picture of the protests last year as having been influenced in some way by foreign governments, of there being students on campuses that are being either funded by or are under the ideological sway of organizations like Hamas or Hezbollah. There's really no real evidence that that's the case. And even if there were, the vast majority of these students who are being deported and scrutinized for protest activity are not, a lot of them were barely politically active. Not that political activity means that you are a national security threat. It certainly doesn't. It shouldn't. But Take the student at Columbia University, Ranjani Srinivasan, who the Trump administration described as voluntarily deporting herself to Canada. She was a PhD at Columbia. She was walking home from a picnic and was arrested along with hundreds of other Columbia students in one of the large NYPD raids on campus in kind of all the chaos and confusion. And her case was very quickly dismissed last year. But anyone with even a smidgen of an arrest record like that is being, ICE is knocking on their door, right? Rumeysa Öztürk at Tufts, wrote an op-ed in the campus newspaper, actually my old campus newspaper. I went to Tufts and wrote for the Tufts Daily. And I mean, I saw that video. I've gotten late night pizza on that street. It's really quite jarring to think that an op-ed there is kind of what seems to have justified her abduction on the street. But like I said before, there are these broad, sweeping mandates that are being used in the service of this kind of policy of mass visa revocation on a scale and scope in terms of student visas that have absolutely never really been seen before. It's such a broad mandate that there's no real onus on the government to provide evidence that any of these students really are national security threats. We just kind of have to take their word for it.
And Clay, before we go to break, you're actually currently in Washington, D.C., advocating for funding for international student programs and also educating lawmakers about contributions that international students are making to our economy and society. What are we losing if international students no longer study here in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's right. I'm here representing ERC and supporting NAFSA for the Advocacy Day, and I had the opportunity to speak with Senators Warner, Kane, and Bennett, or their staffs, yesterday about these topics, which were really valuable conversations. But international students provide myriad benefits to the United States, including diverse global perspectives and intercultural exchange, which is intrinsically valuable in its own right, international experiences for domestic students who may not be able to study abroad, in-demand job skills desired by employers like language skills, intercultural communication, national security benefits, direct financial benefits for institutions due to the high tuition rates they pay, as well as broader economic impact. I mean, in Connecticut alone, the 20,000 international students contribute almost $800 million to the economy and over 6,000 jobs every year.
You just heard from Clay Harmon, who's an executive director of ARRC, and also Liam Knox, who's an admissions and enrollment reporter for Inside Higher Ed. They'll both be staying with us. Coming up next, we're asking, what are colleges and universities doing to support international students? Let us know if you are an international student and you'd like to share your story. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. More than 1 million international students study at universities in the United States. That's according to a 2024 report from the International Education Exchange. In recent weeks, some international students have been targeted for deportation by the Trump administration for their activism or speech. That crackdown is affecting the sense of safety and belonging some international students feel on their campuses, whether they've participated in protests or not. Still with us is Liam Knox, Clay Harmon, and Kirk Carapeza. You can also join the conversation and let us know if you have any questions or if you would like to share your story, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Liam, I want to jump straight to you here. We focused a lot on students so far, but I'm also wondering what's at stake for colleges and universities. Can you talk about the experiences that they're facing right now when they're not able to protect their students from having their visas revoked or ultimately deportation?
Certainly. It's like I mentioned earlier, it's a really jarring experience for a lot of university officials who've spent their lives navigating a student visa system that seems to be changing very quickly. And there's a lot of, I've talked to university officials who say that, students are absolutely their first priority and they're doing everything they can do, but that they don't really know what they can do anymore. That is an open question now. And, there are, as we've seen with Harvard, with Columbia, now with Princeton, there's a real a fear of vindictive action from the Trump administration or from immigration officials. I've talked to immigration lawyers and university uh, 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 visa experts who are afraid, with some, I think, valid grounds, that if they are seen to be helping students too much to avoid ICE raids, or to, certainly if they advised them to, to hide or to try to fight the decisions in court, that they might be subject to some kind of punitive action, whether that's a an investigation from an agency called the Student Exchange and Visitor Program, that might have decertify them from enrolling any international students, or whether that's just a kind of retaliation from these agencies that targeting more students, making more trouble on campus. And so there's a real balancing act, I think, that universities are struggling to maintain. And there's a lot at stake there. I mean, Clay mentioned this earlier, but international students are a major part of the higher ed infrastructure. They're a major part of the education economy. For a lot of colleges, full tuition paying international students subsidize in college financial aid for a lot of domestic students. They subsidize whole academic programs. The way that international enrollment has been evolving over time, now there are a huge growth area is in graduate programs, especially STEM graduate programs. And a lot of that research money, a lot of those tuition dollars, if they disappear, there are colleges that are going to be in real trouble. So there's this kind of strange and fraught calculation where colleges and college officials are asking themselves, do I get in trouble now by helping my students and maybe going to court over some of these status termination decisions? Or do I get in trouble later if there are international students who don't have faith that their campus is going to protect them? I mean, this is a really live and evolving issue. So those questions are still, I think, colleges are still grappling with that.
Well, and Clay, I'm curious to hear what you're hearing from colleges and universities. And as we've shared earlier, that we've reached out to universities here in Connecticut, and many of them declined to speak to us because of the fear of retaliation. But one administrator did share with us that the people supporting visa-sponsored students and faculty in higher education feel helpless right now, and that the ground is shifting under their feet. Is that something that you're hearing as well, Clay?
Yeah, I am hearing similar sentiments from our members. And I think Liam was right to point out that this is all unprecedented. These are new, not newly enumerated powers, but newly kind of rediscovered powers or reinterpreted powers that have never been used in these ways before. And so institutions are not prepared to respond. And if you combine that with the multiple threats to federal funding, which is a huge cudgel that institutions can place over, or that the government can place over institutions. Keep in mind that when we talk about federal funding being revoked for an institution, that means financial aid for domestic students, which makes up a huge proportion of many institutions' budgets, not to mention research funding and not to mention everything else. Decertification would cut off the flow of that international student tuition revenue as well. So I think institutions are really struggling with figuring out what is the best way to respond. Mm-hmm. And I would say that from my experience of working in international admissions and with international students for my entire career, the folks who work in these offices are the ones that are there for the right reasons. They're there because they care about the students and they want to do right by them and to ensure to the best of their ability that everyone can have a positive experience and contribute to the cultural diversity. And so these are, I think my colleagues are being deeply affected and moved by this. And there's a lot of frustration that, it is valid that institutions are being cautious and slow in trying to figure out what is the best response and triangulate among all these different factors. And I imagine that the frontline staff who are trying to work with students every day are feeling great emotional turmoil at this moment.
And we've got a quick second here, Clay. Do you think we'll be likely to see fewer students wanting to come to the U.S.?
Absolutely. I think the message that's being sent both within and outside the US is that the United States is no longer safe for everyone. And that will have an impact on international enrollment. But I think it's broader than that because not everyone differentiates between the different visa types as we were talking about. So you could see an impact on other sectors. If you're an international business person or an international tourist, would you have second thoughts about coming to the US as well?
And I want to come back to Kirk real quick. We've got about a minute and a half here. We'd love to hear any thoughts you'd like to react to or anything that you're following up as you continue to report on this space.
Yeah, I mean, the threats facing higher ed now, I think, as Clay and Liam said, are unprecedented. And when I look at this, it's almost like a two-headed monster, right? There's the political threats coming from the Trump administration, and higher ed has few defenders right now because of the cost, right? A lot of Americans look at the cost. They're like, yeah, it's too expensive. And most Americans go to college within 25 miles of their homes. So they see Harvard, Columbia, UPenn, Princeton, these schools that are under intense pressure. They see these campuses as, they might as well be on another planet, right? And on the campaign trail, we heard then, candidate Trump hammer colleges for being too expensive, too radical, too quote unquote woke. And when I bring that to progressive people on campus, professors, administrators, they say, yes, yes, and yes. And that message resonates with Americans who see these institutions as out of touch with their concerns. The other threat, of course, is the demographic and economic threat. And I think separating that from the politics is so important because that affects all of us, right? Colleges need international students. The pool of college-age students is about to dry up. In 2026, we're facing a demographic cliff. The number of 18-year-olds is going to plummet because it's 18 years after the Great Recession when Americans stopped having kids. And so colleges and our workforce actually need more international students to fill this coming gap. And that message, I think, is being lost in the noise.
Well, we look forward to hearing updates from your reporting. You've been listening to Kirk Carapesa, who is an education reporter with GBH News. You are also listening to Liam Knox, who's with Inside Higher Ed, and also Clay Harmon, who is with AIRC. Thank you all so much for joining us today and having this very important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Robin Doyon-Aiken, Tess Terrible, Meg Dalton, and Kathy Wang. Our technical producer is Jean Amatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.